It's a crisis. You know, I've heard the word crisis used for many things recently that are not a crisis. The decline in marriage is not a crisis. People leaving the church is not a crisis. The male loneliness epidemic, it's not a crisis. Um, the birth rate dropping, it's not a crisis. These are consequences or results of people's choices. And that is the thing that I think is very interesting. We live, at least I live, in America. America is supposed to be the land of the free. It's supposed to be a place where you have choice and opportunities and options. But it seems that whenever people, especially women, exercise their choices or their options in ways that may not benefit capitalism or patriarchy, those options and choices become very problematic and they get labeled a crisis. Women were told to choose better men. Okay. They did start choosing better men. And when they couldn't find better men, they said, I'll be single. I'll focus on building community. I'll focus on my career. I'll focus on education. And now that choice that actually women were told to make and they were shamed for not making and they were criticized for not making, now that they've made it, now the marriage rate's down, the birth rate's down, there's a male loneliness epidemic, and all of these things are happening with men because women were a cushion for society. These men that are not in these relationships now are acting out in many different ways that are not positive. They're having addictions and temptations and making choices that are basically self-destructive because they don't want to evolve. They don't want to go to therapy. They don't want to work on their personality or their social anxiety or build their own support systems outside of romantic relationships or leave behind patriarchal thinking of, toxic masculinity, kind of putting down everything that really could evolve them, like education, like certain jobs, like therapy, like empathy, like vulnerability, like building strong, supportive friendships as a feminine desire, as a feminine trait, as a feminine goal. So now that these options are being chosen, it's a crisis. It's a problem. It needs to be solved. The government needs to intervene to take away women's access to education, to voting, to grants, to credit, to no-fault divorce, to certain types of birth control, to, overturning Roe v. Wade. I mean, there's all of these ideas that are being pumped out to take away or limit choice, options, opportunity. And it's all because this patriarchal society likes the status quo and doesn't like change and fears the unknown and doesn't want to evolve or ascend or elevate. They want to stay exactly where they are. And if there is any change, they want it to be monetarily in the form of greed, getting more. They don't want it to be spiritually or socially or culturally. And it reminds me of history. When you had the Civil War, one of the reasons that the South seceded was they kept saying that freeing these enslaved people would destroy the Southern way of life. It would destroy the Southern economy. And the thing is, again, they didn't want to evolve. They didn't want to give up something that they were never entitled to in the beginning. Patriarchy, colonization, slavery creates a system that never should have existed in the beginning. People should have never been made inferior by law. They never should have had rights taken away from them by law. Discrimination should have never been legalized. Oppression should have never been legalized. None of this stuff should have ever existed. But because it was put into law, it was put into policy, then people got entitled to it, the ones who were benefiting from it, and they don't want to give it up. But that's the thing. When you have oppression, it hurts both sides. One of the beauties of being a reader is you get to read all kinds of texts. And I remember reading Frederick Douglass. He had not only his narrative of Frederick Douglass, but he also had many other essays. And one of the essays that I remember reading, speaking about, writing about his mistress, the woman who owned him, okay, the mistress of the plantation, and how when he first came into her care, she was the kindest, most generous, most helpful, most beautiful human being he had ever met in her soul. And she was teaching him to read. And her husband found out and became very angry with her. You are going to spoil him because you're going to open his mind to options and opportunities and choices that we don't want him to have. And not only that, you're going to make me look bad because it's going to be assumed that I haven't taught my wife properly. I don't have control over my household. So you're going to make me look bad. And by making me look bad, you're going to diminish my status in the community. And that's going to limit the money that I can make, the connections I can have, the power and status we can have. And so she was floored by this information and decided that she was going to, swing the other way and become a staunch supporter of her husband and his beliefs in the Southern way. And then she became the cruelest person that he had ever met. She went from the best to the worst because the power that she realized she had over him, it corrupted her. It changed her. She was lured into this mindset of superiority and of all that mindset could do for her and her husband. And that's the thing about entitlement. It cripples the oppressors and the oppressed, because she was a better person when she didn't feel superior. She was a better person when she felt like all human beings were equal. All human beings should have access to education. All human beings should have choices and options and respect. And when she was taught, no, hey, no, don't do that. Don't believe that. Don't think that. Don't feel that. Don't act that way. She became a worse person. So patriarchy and colonization and even capitalism to some degree has taken away some of the goodness in people. They've allowed it to because they want power and status, and they want the hierarchy, and they like the feeling of power, and they like their ego stroked. So again, you're making, or I'm going to say the people who say these things are making these choices and the ability to take away or give consent a crisis. And it's not a crisis, it's just reality. The reality is that women don't have to have kids. They don't have to get married. They don't have to be in relationships. They can make choices. Okay? They don't have to be intimate with men. It doesn't matter how much money men have. It doesn't matter what men say or do. Women have choices. It's not a crisis. It's just reality. And it's just evolution and ascension and change and options being shown, which should have always been there. May you walk in